it's Two Sheds here with a new video. This time about one of the greatest icons of the 20th century, and of the 21st century for that matter. That being England's longest serving monarch in their whole history, Queen Elizabeth II. Quite possibly the most famous person in living memory right now, and someone who will always have a place in history, probably even another 70 years from now. So today, I'm gonna tell her whole story for y'all, spanning all her decades of service for the Commonwealth and even the world as a whole. As I'm sure you can guess, we got a lot of ground to cover in this video, so let's get going. So Elizabeth was born in London, England, more specifically at her grandfather's home in Mayfair, on April 21st, 1926, to Prince Albert, the Duke of York, and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon of the Windsor family. She was born during the reign of her grandfather, King George V, though was not expected to ever hold the throne since her father was only second in line to the throne after her uncle, Edward, the Prince of Wales, which of course placed her all the way back in third. As a child, she was affectionately called Lilibet by the rest of her family. Throughout her early life, she was publicized due to her loving relations with her grandfather and other wholesome activities of that variety. In 1930, she was joined by a sister, Princess Margaret, who would go on to be another key figure in her life. Of course, being princesses, the two were pretty indoorsy girls growing up, during which time they were privately tutored in a variety of subjects before, she actually had subjects. She had a pretty happy childhood until a certain someone drove a wedge in the family. So Elizabeth's grandfather, King George V, died in early 1936, concluding a reign of 26 years. He was succeeded originally by her uncle, who became King Edward VIII. This made her father the new heir to the throne, but they weren't counting on anything big. Despite the fact that Edward VIII was then in his 40s and, uncommon for the time, still unmarried, he was still expected to possibly someday marry and have children. By most accounts, Prince Bertie had little interest in becoming king anyway. But in a shocking twist, Edward VIII, in order to marry a woman the government did not approve of, abdicated his position after less than a year, in the process becoming England's only ever king to abdicate voluntarily. With Prince Bertie next in line, he became the new king and took on the new identity, King George VI, in order to emphasize continuity with his father during that turbulent event. While the UK used male preference succession to decide the line of succession at the time, young Elizabeth had no brothers and was thus the heir to the throne upon moving into Buckingham Palace. As she grew older, she took on more important duties, like becoming a war hero. So in 1939, the UK entered World War II with the Allied powers. In order to stay out of danger, Elizabeth was moved to Sandringham House, which was a bit further out of the way compared to the remains of the capital, which had seen better days. It was during the war where Elizabeth gave her first speech on the BBC radio in order to encourage the people of Britain during their darkest hour. As she got older, she began getting more personally involved with the war effort, such as giving goodwill tours at various army bases. Once she was finally old enough, she served in the army firsthand, though the only thing she was really doing was driving and fixing trucks. So if you were picturing something like this, sorry to disappoint. With the war in Europe finally over on May 8th, 1945, Elizabeth and the rest of her family took part in the VE celebrations in London, moving back into Buckingham Palace for the first time in 5.5 years. After the war, she continued taking on a much more active role with the royal family, even joining her parents on a Commonwealth tour in Africa. While she loved dearly the people who kept her country safe, there was one man in particular who caught her eye. So as a young child, Elizabeth met Prince Philip of Greece. Though the aforementioned war made it difficult to keep in touch, they sent letters back and forth with each other, and quickly became inseparable. After the war, once their relationship had been discovered, it attracted a bit of controversy, as under both Greek and Danish law, Philip couldn't keep his royal standing in either country if he married into a different royal family, such as the UK's. Eventually, Philip decided he didn't care and renounced his claim in both countries. He was compensated a bit when he was named the Duke of Edinburgh, a title which he would continue to hold for the next 74 years. Elizabeth and Philip finally married on November 20th, 1947, at a large-scale ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Most of Philip's family, however, didn't attend due to their unfortunate Nazi ties, which wasn't the best look to be walking through London so soon after the war. In any case, the pair would eventually accumulate 4 children: Charles, Anne, Andrew, and Edward. By the way, is now a good time to mention that they were both second cousins and third cousins? Sweet home Alabama. The two would live a pretty luxurious life, but soon their lives would change forever. So, in early 1952, King George VI intended to take a tour through Kenya, a colony owned by the UK at the time. But as it happened, days before he was set to embark, he was feeling a bit under the weather, so he sent Elizabeth, accompanied by Prince Philip, to take his place on the tour instead. This is not an uncommon thing for Elizabeth to do if George wasn't able to perform his duties due to health problems. But along the way, something decidedly uncommon did happen. On February 6th, 1952, George died unexpectedly in his sleep by coronary thrombosis. Word reached Elizabeth the next day, and she was quickly proclaimed the new queen, now known as Queen Elizabeth II. England's got a new queen. Due to this unexpected occurrence, Elizabeth ended the tour early and moved back into Buckingham Palace, now as the primary resident. Immediately, there was confusion of which royal house Prince Charles, now the heir to the throne himself, would belong to. While more often than not, a royal house is determined by the father's royal house, public figures such as Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Queen Dowager Mary of Teck wanted to keep the House of Windsor around for the foreseeable future. Ultimately, Elizabeth decided that was the best course of action, and thus, the House of Windsor continues to this day. Elizabeth was crowned on June 2nd, 1953 in Westminster Abbey on a live broadcast, a first for a coronation ceremony. The people of the Commonwealth were always at her side, so let's see what her course of action will be. So by the time Elizabeth was queen, the entity once known as the British Empire was starting to change into its current form, the Commonwealth. Shortly after the coronation, she went on a lengthy tour of it, even reaching such nations as Australia and New Zealand. Despite these places having been under the crown for a long time, she was actually the first monarch to visit either. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows during this time, as in 1956, the UK, in an effort to get control of the Suez Canal, went to war with Egypt. Let's just say this did not go very well. In fact, it went so badly that Prime Minister Anthony Eden was forced to resign in disgrace. As the Conservative Party used meetings to decide their leaders at the time, unlike the Labour Party, Elizabeth was forced to rely on but a few select people to decide who to choose, and ultimately they appointed Harold Macmillan to take his place. Though the Suez Canal crisis had ended by then, this method of choosing leadership was becoming very unpopular through the Conservative Party, and it was only further exacerbated in 1963 when she used a similar process to choose Macmillan's successor, Alec Douglas Home. Thankfully, after this, the party decided that wider leadership elections was the way to go from then on, thus minimizing her involvement in controversial political affairs. On a brighter note, in 1957, she visited North America for the first time. In the first of many of her visits to the United States, she spoke to the United Nations in New York City. That October, she opened Parliament in Canada, being the first monarch to ever do so personally. Her tradition of touring stayed strong afterwards, as in 1961, she did a tour in Asia as well, though these Commonwealth tours couldn't last forever, as we'll see. During Elizabeth's reign, various territories in Africa split from the UK, and even the Crown as a whole in some cases. The UK wanted to shift its focus away from Africa and back towards Europe anyway, as seen when it joined the European Union in 1973. Let's see how long that lasts. While things were looking fine from the outside for the country, on the inside there was a bit of chaos, as in the general election of February 1974, resulted in the first hung parliament in decades. The UK wasn't the only country struggling politically that Elizabeth controlled, as Australia faced a similar crisis the following year after a controversial dismissal of Prime Minister Gough Whitlam that nearly resulted in Australia abandoning the crown and may have gotten there under a lesser monarch. However, after she got them over that hurdle, on February 6, 1977, the Commonwealth celebrated her Silver Jubilee, commemorating the 25th anniversary of her ascension to the throne. Despite the turbulent times, Elizabeth proved to be a popular, unifying leader in every country that she was involved in. She was making visits most as a state wouldn't even dream of at the time, such as Yugoslavia and even communist China. However, her challenge in the next 2.5 decades would be a bit more personal. So on July 29, 1981, Elizabeth's eldest son and heir apparent, Charles, married Lady Diana Spencer in St. Paul's Cathedral. Remember that, it'll become important a little later. Elizabeth attended, despite that year having faced a couple of close calls and assassination attempts, though thankfully she was never seriously injured, thanks to the help of one Enrico Palazzo. Sadly, some of her subjects were, when the UK once again went to war, this time with Argentina in April of 1982, after they attempted to invade the Falkland Islands, a territory still owned directly by the UK. While the war was finished fairly quickly, Elizabeth was also caught off guard by an American invasion of Grenada, which was part of the Commonwealth, which most of the UK was very opposed to. Thankfully, upon meeting, she and President Ronald Reagan were able to sort things out and de-escalate any tensions. However, one of the people she couldn't stand the most in her life, especially around this era, was Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. While the two had the foresight to downplay these tensions in public, behind the scenes, Elizabeth strongly opposed her economic policies and lack of action taken to prevent injustice around the world, particularly in South Africa. However, thankfully, Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney was much more keen on ending the apartheid she held concerns about. While the UK was not involved there, they were still involved militarily in the Cold War. Not that that had much longer left. So the 1990s actually got off to a pretty good start, as the coalition that the UK was a key player for finally won the Cold War, which had been on everyone's radar since World War II. Elizabeth was even granted the rare privilege of being able to address the United States Congress as a non-member. However, the next year, 1992, would prove the most challenging of her human lifespan, mostly because of those pesky Republicans. Now, for those of you who just got upset because I said that, I'm not talking about the MAGA kind of Republicans. I'm talking about the British kind of Republicans. Those being the people who want to abolish the monarchy. They were particularly upset that year when a fire broke out at Windsor Castle and taxpayers' money was being used to fix the damages. However, Elizabeth was thankfully able to remedy the situation pretty effectively by paying a big part of that taxpayers' money from her own income and making the royal family more open in general. However, with more openness comes more vulnerability to scandal. While nothing major hit her, despite who was prime minister at the time, her family began to face scrutiny after Prince Charles and his wife Diana were discovered to have been separated and eventually divorced, which hadn't happened to someone in the line to the throne since before the UK had officially formed. Not helping was that Diana was eventually suddenly killed in a car crash barely a year later, which left her two then fairly young children without a mother. In a national address, Elizabeth got the nation back on track after the virtually national mourning and helped get her family's reputation, mostly, back into good graces. On December 31st, 1999, Elizabeth opened the Millennium Dome just in time for the year 2000 to strike. However, the 21st century had its own share of surprises, as the UK was once again pulled into a coalition with the United States and its allies, this time in the War on Terror, along with several other Commonwealth countries the United States was allied with. As usual, in her life there were many more successes and struggles. For instance, on February 6th, 2002, the Commonwealth celebrated her Golden Jubilee, commemorating the 50th anniversary of her ascension to the throne, a rare feat for any monarch. Despite the situation the world was in, millions throughout the world shared their love and enthusiasm for her and her leadership. Unfortunately, around that time, her sister Margaret died at the age of 72, followed by her mother at the incredible age of 102. However, even these losses couldn't hurt Elizabeth's almost legendary image she had acquired by then. People were gladly assisting in the war effort, and as she had herself 6 decades ago, despite her personal concerns that the army was overreaching. As even more years followed, she had begun to reach record-breaking territories. In 2007, for instance, she and Philip became Britain's first royal couple to be married for 60 years. And by the end of that year, she had become the longest-lived monarch the UK had ever had. She would only extend that record further as time went on, and it still stands, and probably will for a long time. Elizabeth continued to make things right around the world, as she even made the first visit by a monarch to Ireland since its independence. Despite her now advancing age, she was now fulfilling her head of state duties better than ever before. So, on February 6th, 2012, the Commonwealth celebrated Elizabeth's Diamond Jubilee, this time commemorating the 60th anniversary of her ascension to the throne, an even rarer accomplishment than the ceremony just 10 years prior. She was only the second monarch in England's whole history to make it to this milestone, Sadly, the tour of the UK she and Philip took would be one of the last they ever went on, as their age was starting to catch up to the pair, being 86 and 91 years old at this point. She mostly stayed at home or nearby during her autumn years, and Prince Charles began to take on some of her duties. However, one thing she never intended to do, regardless of age, was abdicate outright. If you recall what happened in the 1930s, it's easy to see why. As a result, her reign went on, and she reached a record over 6 decades in the making. On September 9th, 2015, she surpassed her ancestor, Queen Victoria, as both England's longest-serving monarch and the longest-serving female world leader ever on record. The following year, upon the death of King Rama IX, I'd rather call him that than however you actually say this name, of Thailand, she became the longest-serving world leader of her time. And the year after that, on top of celebrating the UK's first ever Sapphire Jubilee, the 65th anniversary of her ascension, she and Philip celebrated their 70th wedding anniversary together, proving that some people are just meant to be together like that, I guess. In 2020, the UK, alongside the rest of the world, I should know, was hit with the COVID-19 pandemic. Elizabeth was moved over to Windsor Castle and stayed there, though gave broadcasts to encourage her citizens through the situation. However, on April 9th, 2021, Philip, her cousin husband of almost 74 years, which, by the way, is the longest royal marriage in recorded history, died at the age of nearly 100 in her presence. Despite the pandemic, he was given a public funeral where Elizabeth famously sat alone due to the virus. Despite all precautions, she later caught the virus, but quickly recovered despite being well into her 90s by now. By February 6, 2022, however, COVID had cleared enough to celebrate Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee, commemorating the 70th anniversary of her ascension to the throne, which was also the first ceremony of its kind. After the ceremony, Elizabeth all but finally retired from her duties as queen and decided to spend her final days at Balmoral Castle, although she still remained on the throne at an official level. She even stayed around long enough to surpass the aforementioned King Rama IX as the second longest serving world leader in recorded history, surpassed only by King Louis XIV of France. However, as they say, all good things must come to an end. On September 8th, 2022, many of Elizabeth's relatives were seen entering Balmoral Castle. That afternoon, she died of bone marrow cancer at the age of 96, concluding her 70-year-long reign. She was immediately succeeded by her heir, now known as King Charles III. Her coffin was taken to Westminster Hall for public viewing. After that, she was given a state funeral, the first in the UK since 1965. The broadcast was viewed internationally and even surpassed the original moon landing as the most viewed broadcast ever, for good reason. At that point, the majority of the world's population had never known an England without Elizabeth. For the final time, many would say, God save the Queen. It's hard to really make a video encompassing everything about such a long-standing video such as Queen Elizabeth, but in a way she made it easier. I mean, her legacy speaks for itself. It's hard to find a person in the world today who never knew who she was, or someone who can come back from controversy as many times as she could effectively, for that matter. She was a queen everyone, under her or not, could be inspired from, whether it was in the 50s or the 20s. But regardless, I'd like to thank you for watching through to the end. This has been Two Shads. Hope to see you next time.